It is my joy to welcome you to today's Heart of a Shepherd. This is Tuesday. It is December the 19th, 2023, and we are today in the book of 1 Kings, that wonderful historical book, and I've titled today's devotion, How Long Will a Just God Overlook a Nation's Sin? So the scripture reading is 1 Kings chapter 13. Well, Israel, having rejected Rehoboam as king, the 10 tribes in the north, now known as Israel, did follow Jeroboam, and they made that rebel their king. Now, 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, now identified as Judah in the scriptures, continue to serve Rehoboam. Now, King Jeroboam, fearing the worship of the Lord in Jerusalem might unite the people, established an idolatrous religion and encouraged the people to worship 2 golden calves which he had shaped and formed. He placed one in Bethel and the other in Dan. And Jeroboam then ordained, and I quote, that the lowest of the people should serve as his priests, for apparently the sons of Levi refused to participate in Jeroboam's idolatry. Well, Jeroboam, acting as a priest himself, we read, offered sacrifices on the altar he built in Bethel, and we find him there in today's scripture reading, 1 Kings chapter 13. I'm going to suggest to you that the subheading for 1 Kings 13 might be Wickedness and Tragedy in Israel. Now, for our first point, consider with me verses 1 through 10. For here the Lord sent his prophet to condemn Bethel's idolatry. Now, we do not know the prophet's name, but the Lord sent a preacher to declare the word of the Lord and condemn Jeroboam's idolatry and the altar he built at Bethel in verse 1. Now, the prophet foretold a son of David's lineage would be born in Judah and be named Josiah in verse 2. Now, Josiah's reign, we see described as ushering in a season of revival for God's people. Now, Josiah was prophesied that he would destroy the illegitimate altar at Bethel, and the false prophets and dead men's bones would be burnt upon the altar, according to chapter 13 and verse 2. Well, Jeroboam was furious with the prophet. When the king stretched forth his hand, though, to order the prophet seized, the king's hand drew up, and we read in verse 4 that it withered. Jeremiah cried for mercy, and the prophet prayed, and the king's hand was restored in verse 6. Well, restored to health, the king, Jeroboam, invited the prophet to his home for food, drink, and a gift. However, the prophet of the Lord refused, for he had been commanded of the Lord to neither eat nor drink in Bethel. And so the prophet departed another way, in verse 10, as commanded. Well, then notice with me verse 11 through 32. And here we have an act of disobedience, and for the prophet, a tragic end. Now, the prophet was met along the way by, and I quote, an old prophet in Bethel, verse 11. Now, despite the idolatry and wickedness Jeroboam established in Bethel, the old prophet and his sons continued to live there. And hearing the prophet from Judah had condemned the altar and confronted Jeroboam, the elderly prophet invited him to his home for bread and water. Well, when he heard the hesitancy of the prophet, the old prophet lied, and he persuaded him that the Lord had sent him to bring the prophet to his home to eat bread and to drink water. All this, of course, contrary to God's commandment. Well, contrary to the Lord's commands, then the prophet heeded the old prophet's words, and we read in verses 19 through 22 that he disobeyed the Lord and he invited God's wrath upon himself. Well, even as they ate, God suddenly filled the old prophet's mouth with his judgment against the prophet from Judah, and he foretold that that man would die along the way and not be buried in his father's tomb, which was obviously located in Judah. Well, soon after sending the prophet from Judah away, the old prophet heard there was a man slain outside Bethel. and a donkey and a lion stood over his lifeless body. Well, that was obviously a scene very contrary to nature for a donkey and a lion, a beast, the king of the beast, be standing together. But you see, though contrary to nature, it was the act of God. Well, the old prophet believed it was God's judgment, and he said, and I quote, "It is the man of God who was disobedient unto the word of the Lord. Therefore the Lord hath delivered him unto the lion, which hath torn him and slain him." Well, leaving his home, the elderly prophet found and retrieved the lifeless body of the prophet from Judah. And we read in verse 27 and 28 that the old prophet lamented the death of the other prophet. In fact, he even commanded that the body of the dead prophet be placed in his tomb, and instructed his sons that when he died, he was to be buried in the same tomb. Well, though he had failed to condemn the sins and idolatry of Bethel, the old prophet does acknowledge the words of the prophet from Judah, and he asserted the judgment of God would indeed fall on that place, even as the prophet foretold in verse 32. Then verse 33 and 34, here we have now King Jeroboam and Israel continuing in wickedness. Well, the prophet's cry against the altar at Bethel did not dissuade Jeroboam or Israel from idolatry. Instead, the king led the people, we read, in his evil way. And once again, we're reminded that Jeroboam chose of the lowest of the people, priests, the high places, whosoever would. He consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And so once again, we see the wickedness of man. And sadly, this wicked, sinful, depraved world that we live in, it often promotes to positions of highest authority the very ones who are the lowest of men in the eyes of God. Well, so great was the wickedness that the Lord determined he would cut off Jeroboam's lineage. And we read in verse 34, "and destroy it from off the face of the earth." Well, closing thought, I want to invite you to take a moment and look at your world. Look around you. Examine your home, your church, and any institutions with which you are affiliated or that you support. Now, if we're honest, like in the days of Jeroboam and Israel, compromise has become the way of believers and most churches today. The preachers fail to speak against the wickedness of the world, and our homes, churches, and schools are embracing gross wickedness. Well, if God is faithful and just, and He is, He will pour out His judgment on this generation that justifies its sins and depravity under the pretense of liberty, love, and grace. In the words of the prophet Samuel, "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken, that is, hearken to the word of the law of God, than the fat of rams." Well, what a great challenge that is as we face the end of this year and look at a new year that is ahead. That will not be numbered among those who are willing to compromise with the sins of not only the world, but too often the sins of even those who profess to be God's people. We are living in a wicked, depraved day. And my friend, if you're not careful, you will bow the knee to idols. Oh, it might not be the idol shaped like a calf, but idols of the heart that are like the ways of the world. May you and I be found faithful, even if it means standing alone. God bless you, and bye-bye.